She was handcuffed in the hallway she had saved dozens of lives in, scrubs still damp from the last patient she'd treated, badge stripped, security on both sides. Hospital Director Everett Caldwell stood 20 feet away with his arms crossed, watching like he'd won something. He'd called the police on a nurse. He'd told them she stole classified military files. He'd done it with a straight face, in front of her colleagues, in front of patients who could hear everything through thin curtain walls. What Caldwell didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a Black Hawk helicopter was already cutting through the sky toward Redstone Valley Medical Center, and the people inside it weren't coming for her. They were coming for him. If you've made it this far, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story is going to go places you won't see coming. Hit like, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning started the way most of Maya Whitmore's mornings started, with someone else's emergency and not enough hands. She'd clocked in at 6:45, 20 minutes before her shift officially began, because the overnight team always left the supply cart in the wrong position and nobody ever restocked the trauma bay drawers the way they were supposed to be restocked. It wasn't her job to fix it. She did it anyway. She'd been doing it anyway for 4 years. Redstone Valley Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Delport, a mid-sized city in a state that couldn't decide if it wanted to be industrial or suburban, and had settled into a messy compromise of both. The hospital wasn't the best in the region and wasn't the worst, which was maybe the most honest thing you could say about it. It had good equipment, average staffing, and leadership that spent more time managing optics than managing care. Maya had figured that out during her first week. She was 29, which made her one of the younger nurses in the emergency department, and she had a face that people consistently underestimated. Not because she looked young exactly, but because she had the kind of stillness that people mistook for passivity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue in meetings. When something was wrong, she fixed it and moved on. That, she had learned, was a liability in a place like Redstone Valley, where visibility mattered more than competence, and the people who talked loudest got the credit. The trauma bay was quiet when she walked in. Too quiet for a Tuesday, which meant it was about to not be. Whitmore. Donnie Ruiz was already at the nursing station, half a cup of coffee in one hand, a patient chart tilted toward the light with the other. Danny was a charge nurse, 5 years older than Maya, and one of the few people in the department Maya actually trusted. Overnight left us a sepsis case in Bay 3, a possible bowel perf in 2, and someone taped the defibrillator charging cable to the wall with packing tape instead of reporting the mount as broken. I saw that, Maya said. She set her bag down and pulled on gloves. I'll put in the maintenance ticket. Already did. Danny looked up. Caldwell's doing rounds this morning. The way she said it wasn't casual. It was a warning dressed up as information. Maya nodded once and didn't say anything else. Everett Caldwell was the hospital director, which at Redstone Valley meant he was the person everyone accommodated and no one fully trusted. He had the right credentials, an MBA and a background in hospital administration, not medicine. And he had a particular way of walking through the emergency department that communicated very clearly that he considered himself a visitor in a place he technically owned. He would pause near the good outcomes. He would be somewhere else when things went wrong. And when things went wrong and then got better because someone had worked past the point of exhaustion to fix them, Caldwell had a talent for materializing just in time to take the summary of events and rephrase it, in emails or at board meetings, as his own decision. Maya had watched him do it to 3 different nurses in 4 years. She'd watched it happen to attending physicians. She'd watched it happen to herself, twice, before she'd understood the pattern well enough to stop being surprised by it. The sepsis patient in Bay 3 needed 2 liters of fluid, a blood culture, and a conversation with someone who wasn't panicking. Maya gave him all 3. The possible bowel perf in Bay 2 turned out to be confirmed on imaging, and she had the surgical consult paged and at the bedside in 11 minutes, which was fast enough that the resident mentioned it. By 9:15, she had cleared both bays, updated the medication reconciliation for a patient who'd come in the night before with an incomplete medication list, and identified a dosing discrepancy in a post-procedure order that would have caused a problem in about 4 hours if nobody caught it. She flagged it to the attending, Dr. Reese Tamblin, who corrected it without much ceremony. "Good catch," he said, not looking up. "It was in the notes," she said. Which was true, it was just that nobody had read the notes. Caldwell arrived at 9:40. He came with the compliance officer, a woman named Sherry Flagg, who wore her lanyard-like armor and took notes on a tablet that she never seemed to actually reference later. They moved through the department with the energy of a site inspection, pausing at the nursing station, glancing at the whiteboard, exchanging murmured observations. Maya was at the medication dispensary when Caldwell stopped near her. "Whitmore," he said, the same way someone says a word they've mispronounced their whole life and refuses to be corrected about. "I heard there was a medication flag this morning. Dosing discrepancy in a post-procedure order. I flagged it to Dr. Tamblin. It's been corrected." Caldwell nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're composing their version of what you just said. "Good. I'll want to see the incident report." "It won't need an incident report. The error was caught before administration. I'll still want to see the documentation." "Of course," she said, because arguing with him in the hallway in front of Sherry Flagg was not the version of this conversation that would end well. He moved on. She went back to work. The problem had been building for a while, and Maya knew it the way you know weather. Not through instruments, but through something in the air that changes before the storm arrives. Caldwell had been pushing a new protocol through the emergency department for the past 6 weeks, a revised triage and patient flow system that he developed with an outside consultant whose qualifications Maya had quietly looked up and been unimpressed by. The protocol had one major flaw, which was that it triaged patients based partly on projected insurance coverage status, which was not legal, and which would result in underinsured and uninsured patients consistently receiving slower initial assessments. Maya had documented this. She had written a 12-page summary with supporting literature and submitted it through the proper internal channel, a formal concern to the Patient Safety Committee, 3 weeks ago. She had received an automated acknowledgement and nothing else. Last week, she had asked Danny if she'd heard anything. Danny had looked at her with an expression that said, "You know how this goes." Maya had decided she was going to ask again, formally, in writing. She'd drafted the follow-up that morning before her shift. She sent it at 10:03. By 10:45, Caldwell was standing in the doorway of the break room where she was eating a granola bar and looking at lab values on the department tablet. He closed the door. That was the first signal. "I received your message to the Patient Safety Committee," he said. "I sent a follow-up, yes. My original submission was 3 weeks ago with no response." These processes take time, Whitmore. Patients are being triaged under the new protocol starting next Monday. I wanted to ensure the concern was reviewed before implementation. Caldwell put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her the way people look at something they're deciding how to move around. "The protocol has been reviewed and approved by the appropriate stakeholders. The concern I raised is about potential violations of federal anti-discrimination statutes, approved by which stakeholders doesn't address that." His jaw shifted. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we delay implementation until there's a formal legal review of the triage criteria." "That's not your call to make." "No," Maya said. "It's the committee's call. I'm asking them to make it." There was a silence that lasted longer than silences usually lasted. "You've been a problem in this department for a while," Caldwell said. His voice was even, controlled. "You've been difficult with physicians. You've been insubordinate with administration, and now you're making formal accusations against hospital leadership. I made a patient safety report. That's a protected activity under, I know what it is," he said. "I also know what insubordination looks like. And I'm telling you, as the director of this hospital, that your conduct has been noted and it will be addressed." He paused. "Today." Maya looked at him. She kept her face where she wanted it, which was neutral. Not because she wasn't angry, she was in the specific grinding way she got angry when she was watching something preventable happen and couldn't stop it, but because showing it to him would give him something to use. "Are you suspending me?" she asked. "I'm removing your badge access pending an administrative review. For submitting a patient safety report. For a pattern of insubordinate conduct." He moved toward the door. "Security will escort you out. Leave your badge at the nursing station." He left. The door swung partway closed behind him and then drifted open again, because the hinge had been sticking for months and nobody had fixed it. Maya sat for a moment with the tablet still in her hand and the granola bar wrapper on the table beside her. Then she set the tablet down, picked up the wrapper, threw it away, and walked to the nursing station. Danny was there. She looked at Maya's face and stopped typing. "He suspended me," Maya said quietly. Administrative review. Badge access revoked. Danny stared at her. He can't. You submitted a patient safety. I know. Maya unclipped her badge and set it on the desk. Document everything that happened today. Times, what was said, who was present. If there's an investigation, you'll want your own record. Maya, I'm fine. She wasn't entirely, but that wasn't a conversation for the nursing station. I'll call the labor board this afternoon. She picked up her bag from the locker and walked toward the exit. The lobby was mid-morning busy, families in chairs, someone at the information desk with a folded paper, the background noise of a building that processes human distress at scale and tries to make it feel manageable. Maya moved through it and pushed through the main doors into the gray Delport morning. She was in the parking lot, trying to decide if she was going to sit in her car and think or drive straight to a copy shop and print out every piece of documentation she had, when she heard it. Not the helicopter immediately. First, she heard the scanner. A security guard near the ambulance bay had one clipped to his shoulder, and the burst of radio traffic was sharp enough that she turned toward it without thinking. Multiple casualties. Military vehicle accident on Route 9. Inbound to Redstone Valley. ETA 11 minutes. She stopped walking. A military vehicle accident on Route 9. Multiple casualties. 11 minutes. She knew what that meant for the emergency department. She knew what their current staffing looked like, what their trauma-based situation was, who was on shift and who wasn't. She knew they'd just transferred their best trauma, attending to a procedure 2 floors up. She knew the charge nurse on the floor below Danny's jurisdiction was a newer hire who'd never run a multi-casualty intake. She stood in the parking lot with her bag on her shoulder and made a calculation that wasn't really a calculation, because there was only one answer. She went back inside. Whitmore. The security guard at the front desk, Marcus, who'd been there 6 years and always nodded at her in the morning, looked up with visible uncertainty. Your access. There's a multi-casualty event inbound, she said. Military, 11 minutes out. He hesitated. Marcus. She said it steadily. They're going to need every pair of hands. He looked at the door, looked at her, and stepped back. She went through. The emergency department had already shifted. Someone had heard the radio call, or dispatch had called in, and there was that particular acceleration that happens when people who do emergency work realize they're about to be tested. Danny was on her feet. Dr. Tamblyn was pulling on gloves. 2 nurses Maya didn't know as well were moving supply carts. How many? Danny said immediately when she saw Maya. At least 4, possibly more. Military vehicle. Route 9 accident, so probably high impact. Could be blast injuries or just crash trauma. Blast injuries. Tamblyn looked over his shoulder. We don't have... I know what we have, Maya said. Bay 1 and 4 need to be cleared now. Get me 2 large bore IVs on standby in each bay, O-negative blood pulled from the fridge, and someone call orthopedic trauma and vascular, because we're going to need them. Nobody asked if she was supposed to be there. That was the thing about emergencies in a place like this. The hierarchy flattened under pressure because competence became the only relevant credential. They had 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, Maya reconfigured 2 trauma bays, identified that one of the portable ventilators had a battery issue and swapped it, walked a newer nurse named Tyler through the blast injury intake protocol she'd learned during a trauma certification course 2 years ago that she'd paid for herself, and drank the rest of Danny's coffee because she hadn't eaten enough and her hands needed to be steady. The first ambulance arrived at 11:04, 3 soldiers. The driver of the military transport vehicle, a specialist named something she didn't catch from the paramedic's handoff. Male, mid-20s, blunt force chest trauma, BP dropping. Behind him, a female corporal with a crush injury to the left leg and a lac on her forearm that was bleeding more than the paramedic had managed. Third patient, older, a sergeant, who was conscious and trying to tell everyone he was fine while his oxygen saturation said otherwise. Bay 1, Maya directed the first gurney. Bay 4 for the leg injury. Someone stay with the sergeant until we can get his sat up. He's not fine. He just thinks he is. It was the kind of controlled chaos that looked chaotic from the outside and had a specific logic from the inside if you knew what you were doing. Maya knew what she was doing. She'd known what she was doing in rooms that were significantly louder than this one, with significantly less equipment, and she'd been doing it since before Redstone Valley Medical Center had hired her. She didn't think about that. She thought about the driver's pressure, which was 82/40, and falling, and whether they had time to get him to CT or whether they were doing this here. They did it there. She was elbow deep in the trauma management of the chest injury, working alongside Tamblyn, who was good under pressure, whatever else she thought about hospital politics. When she registered, at the edge of her attention, that Caldwell had arrived in the emergency department. She didn't look up. She heard his voice, elevated, the tone he used when he was performing authority for an audience. She couldn't make out the words over the noise of monitors and instruction and the organized urgency of a trauma team actually working. She finished what she was doing. The driver stabilized. Not great, not out of the woods, but stable enough to move to imaging. She stepped back, let the transport team take over, and peeled off her outer gloves. That was when she noticed the 2 police officers near the nursing station, and Caldwell, standing with them, looking directly at her. He had a file folder in his hand, thin, white, with the kind of importance that people assign to objects when they need them to look official. Beside him was Sherry Flagg, which struck Maya as a strange detail because Sherry Flagg was compliance, not security. Maya walked toward them because walking toward things was the only way she knew how to operate. "Officers," Caldwell said, not to her. "That's the individual I spoke to you about." One of the officers, older, heavy-set, with the expression of someone who processed this kind of call regularly, looked at Maya without particular aggression. "Maya Whitmore?" "Yes." "Ma'am, we have a report of unauthorized access to restricted military medical records. Mr. Caldwell has indicated that you accessed a classified patient database before your badge access was revoked this morning." Maya stood very still. "That's not accurate," she said. "She returned to the hospital after being suspended," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the specific confidence of a man who'd prepared this. "Her badge access was revoked. She entered anyway. And before that, before I suspended her, she had unauthorized access to a restricted military medical program database that this hospital participates in. Files she was never cleared to see." He held up the folder. "I have documentation." Danny was at the nursing station. Tyler was 6 feet away. 3 other staff members were within earshot, and they were all looking. Maya kept her eyes on the officer. "I came back to respond to a multi-casualty emergency. You can confirm that with EMS dispatch. The patients who just came in are military personnel who required immediate care." "She had no authorization to be here," Caldwell said. "The soldiers she was treating are stabilized," Tamblyn said, from somewhere behind Maya. His voice was flat. "That's documented." Caldwell turned toward him. "Dr. Tamblyn, this doesn't concern—" "She ran the trauma intake," Tamblyn said. "On a multi-casualty with blast pattern injuries that none of my current residents are trained for. That concerns me." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked back at the officers. "I want her removed." The heavier officer glanced at his partner, then at Maya. "Ma'am, we need to ask you to step aside with us while we sort this out." "Of course," Maya said. Because arguing in the hallway wasn't going to resolve this. Because the documentation he had was either fabricated or misrepresented, and she knew it, and eventually someone else would know it too. Because she'd been in situations significantly more dangerous than a hospital director with a folder and a compliance officer, and she'd learned that panic was the one thing that made everything worse. She stepped aside with the officers. And that was when the building shook. Not from the inside, well, from above. The sound came through the ceiling, through the walls, through the floor, the specific heavy percussion of helicopter blades at close range, the kind that rattled your back teeth if you'd ever stood near one before. Maya had stood near them before. One of the officers looked up involuntarily. The other reached for his radio. Through the lobby windows, Maya could see it descending toward the hospital helipad on the roof of the adjacent parking structure. A Blackhawk, olive drab, with the kind of movement that wasn't a medical transport and wasn't a news crew and wasn't anything the officers or Caldwell or Sherry Flagg with her tablet had been expecting. Caldwell was still talking. Maya wasn't listening anymore. She was watching the lobby doors. The soldiers came in fast, 4 of them, in uniform, moving with the specific purposefulness of people who had somewhere to be and were not going to be delayed. They were not in combat gear. They were in dress uniform, which was somehow more startling because dress uniform meant this was intentional and official and had been planned before the helicopter left the ground. At their head was a woman, late 40s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, 2 stars on her collar, with the kind of face that had made several hundred decisions in the time it took most people to consider their options. She came through the lobby, through the emergency department entrance, and stopped when she found what she was looking for. The officers with Maya went still. Caldwell stopped talking mid-sentence. The woman's eyes found Maya, and she crossed the remaining distance without looking at anyone else in the room. "Sergeant Whitmore," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it covered the distance to every person in earshot. The room went very quiet. The woman, whose name and rank Maya knew, whose voice she hadn't heard in 3 years, looked at the officers beside Maya, then at the handcuffs one of them was visibly deciding whether to produce. "I'm General Adrienne Volk, Joint Medical Command," she said, in the direction of the officers. "And I need someone to explain to me why you're detaining the person my unit was sent here to protect." The silence that followed General Volk's question wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the kind that made people acutely aware of their hands, of where they were standing, of what they'd said in the last 10 minutes, and whether they could take any of it back. The heavier officer, his name tag said Brunner, looked at General Volk's collar, then at the 2 soldiers who had positioned themselves with the specific casualness of people who knew exactly what they were doing. He looked at Caldwell. Caldwell said nothing, which was, Maya thought, possibly the smartest thing he'd done all day. "Ma'am," Brunner said, "we received a complaint of unauthorized access to restricted records." "From whom?" Brunner glanced at Caldwell again. "From this man." Volk didn't look at Caldwell when she said it. She was still looking at Brunner, who is a hospital administrator with no security clearance, no military affiliation, and no authority whatsoever over Joint Medical Command personnel or assets. "I wasn't aware of any military affiliation," Brunner said carefully. "That's the point of it." Volk turned, finally, and looked at Caldwell directly. It wasn't a long look, it didn't need to be. "Mr. Caldwell." Caldwell's mouth opened. "General, there was a data access issue our IT department flagged. Your IT department flagged an access to a secured military trauma database from this facility," Volk said. "That access was authorized. It was authorized because the individual who made it is an authorized consultant to this program, which your hospital has been participating in for 14 months. She paused. "You weren't informed of the details of that arrangement because the arrangement specifically did not require your knowledge." Something shifted in Caldwell's face. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the specific look of a man recalibrating what kind of trouble he was actually in. "The records she accessed," he started, "were accessed in the course of her duties," Volk said, "which you interrupted this morning by removing her from the building." She turned back to Brunner. "Is there anything else you need from me, officer, or can Sergeant Whitmore return to her work?" Brunner looked at his partner, who gave him a microscopic shrug that communicated very clearly, "This is above us." "No, ma'am," Brunner said. "We'll need to note the circumstances for our report." "I'll have documentation to your department by end of day," Volk said. She said it the way people say things that are already done. Brunner nodded, said something to Maya about the situation being resolved, and both officers moved toward the exit with the quiet relief of people who had been handed an off-ramp. Caldwell watched them go. His folder was still in his hands. He seemed to have forgotten it was there. Maya exhaled slowly through her nose. Her heart was doing something irregular that she was choosing to ignore. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said to Volk, quietly enough that it wasn't for the room. "No," Volk agreed. "But when my aide told me a hospital director had called the police on you, I decided I wanted to." "That's not standard protocol." "No, it isn't." Volk's expression was composed, but there was something underneath it. Not warmth exactly, but the specific regard of someone who had watched another person do difficult things and hadn't forgotten. "The unit at the scene needs you. Walk with me." Maya walked with her. Behind them, she could hear Danny say something under her breath that wasn't quite audible, and Caldwell beginning a sentence that no one was responding to. Well, the injured soldiers were in bays 1, 3, and 4. The corporal with the leg crush injury, her name was Vasquez, Maya got it from her ID band, had a fracture pattern that was going to need orthopedic intervention within the hour, and the vascular consult Maya had called earlier was already at the bedside, looking at imaging with the focused expression of someone who didn't like what they were seeing. The driver, whose name was Pruitt, was post-stabilization and headed to CT. The sergeant who'd insisted he was fine had a hemothorax that disagreed, and Tamblyn was managing that now with a chest tube and the particular strained patience of an attending who was grateful to have something concrete to do. There were 2 more soldiers from the accident who'd been transported to a different facility. Wolk told her that in 4 sentences while they were moving through the department, and one who hadn't made it at the scene. Maya registered that last part and put it somewhere she'd deal with later, which was how she managed most of the things that would otherwise stop her from functioning. "The program," Maya said, when they had a moment near the supply alcove that wasn't in the middle of active patient care. "He's going to ask questions." "He's going to do more than ask questions," Wolk said. "Your hospital administrator filed a formal complaint with the police, which creates a paper record. His legal department is going to see that record. And then they're going to look at what the complaint was about and find out about the program." "They're going to find out about the program." Wolk crossed her arms, which was going to happen eventually anyway, given that Caldwell approved a new triage protocol that would have directly interfered with the terms of the hospital's participation agreement. Maya looked at her. "You know about the protocol?" "I know about the protocol. I've known about it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My patient safety report." "We were made aware of it through a separate channel," Wolk said. "We were monitoring the situation." Maya took a breath. "Why didn't you—" "Because we needed to understand the scope of it first. Whether this was one administrator making a bad decision or something systemic in the hospital's leadership." Wolk met her eyes. "We have a clearer picture now." There was something in that answer that Maya wasn't fully satisfied with, and Wolk could probably tell, because she held Maya's gaze without flinching. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation that fully covered the gap. It was the kind of answer that acknowledged a decision had been made and wasn't going to relitigate it. "The soldiers needed me before you had a clear picture," Maya said. "Yes," Wolk said simply. "They did." A beat of silence. "Vasquez is going to need surgery," Maya said, "because there was work, and the work was where she functioned best. The vascular consult is worried about compartment pressure in the lower leg. We have maybe 40 minutes before that window closes." Wolk nodded. "What do you need?" "Or block time and an orthopedic surgeon who's worked with blast-adjacent trauma. The one we have on call tonight is good, but she hasn't seen this pattern. I can walk her through it, but I need to be in the room." "You're not a surgeon?" "No. But I've scrubbed in on this exact injury type 4 times overseas, and I know what goes wrong." She said it without pride, just as information. "Dr. Tamblyn can clear it if you want it official." Wolk looked at her for a moment. "Get it done," she said. "Pote." What happened in the next 2 hours was the kind of sustained pressure that either broke a department or revealed what it was actually made of. Vasquez went to surgery. Maya was in the room, gloved, beside the orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Nadia Osei, efficient and sharp, who asked exactly the right questions and didn't bristle when Maya answered them. The compartment pressure was worse than imaging had shown, which wasn't unusual, and there was a moment about 40 minutes in where things were genuinely not going the direction anyone wanted, and Maya talked Osei through a decision point that Osei later said, in the recovery room, had probably saved the leg. Pruitt came back from CT with a result that required a cardiovascular surgery consult, which Tamblyn initiated and managed. The sergeant, his name was Kowalski, and he was 51 years old and built like someone who'd spent 3 decades ignoring discomfort, had his chest tube in and his blood pressure trending in the right direction, and he'd stopped trying to convince people he was fine and started instead asking about Pruitt and Vasquez, which Maya answered honestly because he asked directly, and she respected that. "She's in surgery," Maya told him. "Leg. It's going well." Kowalski looked at the ceiling. "She's got a kid," he said. "I know." She didn't know. She said it anyway because sometimes that was what people needed to hold on to. Through all of it, Caldwell was somewhere in the hospital. Maya was aware of him the way you're aware of a structural problem in a building. You can't see it, but you know it's there, and you know eventually it's going to require addressing. She found out what he'd been doing when Danny appeared in the surgical waiting area at the 2-hour mark with the expression of someone carrying news they didn't want to deliver. "He called the board," Danny said. Maya looked up from the case notes she was updating. "Which board?" "The hospital board. He called an emergency session for this afternoon." Danny sat down in the chair beside her, which she only did when something was serious. He's telling them that the military presence constitutes an unauthorized operational intrusion and that you facilitated it. Facilitated it. His word. Maya rubbed the back of her neck. The headache that had been sitting behind her eyes since morning was getting louder. What's the board's read? 3 of them are Caldwell loyalists. 2 are genuinely neutral. 1, Danny paused. One of them called me this morning after the police showed up, before any of this. She wanted to know what was happening on the floor. Who? Miriam Sato. She's been on the board 14 years. She doesn't like Caldwell, but she's never moved against him because she didn't have grounds. Maya considered this. Miriam Sato she knew by name. She'd seen her at 2 hospital events. An older Japanese-American woman who asked specific questions at the annual staff address and seemed to actually listen to the answers. What did you tell her? The truth. What happened this morning, the patient safety report, the triage protocol. I told her I had documentation. Danny hesitated. I hope that was okay. It was okay, Maya said. It was better than okay. She asked me to tell you something. Danny looked at her. She said, don't go anywhere. The board session was at 4 o'clock in the hospital's second-floor conference room, which Maya had been in exactly once before, for a mandatory training on updated documentation procedures that had taken 90 minutes to cover information that could have been an email. It had 12 chairs around a mahogany table that was too big for the room, a projector that took 10 minutes to connect properly, and windows that looked out over the hospital's main entrance. Maya wasn't invited. She hadn't expected to be. She was standing in the hallway outside Bay 3. Kowalski was stable, sleeping, one of the military aides who'd come with Wolk's team sitting with him, when General Wolk found her. The board session, Wolk said. I've been asked to attend. He's going to frame it as an incursion, Maya said. I know, I've dealt with boards before. Wolk said it without drama. There's something I need to tell you before I go in there. Maya waited. The program you've been consulting on, the Trauma Response Integration Program, it wasn't designed just for knowledge sharing. The agreement your hospital signed 14 months ago has specific provisions about the standard of care in this emergency department, specific floors and patient populations that are covered under a joint medical liability arrangement. Maya had known the agreement existed. She hadn't seen all of its terms. I wasn't shown the full contract. No, you were shown your role in it. The contract sits with hospital administration. Wolk paused. Caldwell signed it. The implication of that settled slowly. He signed a contract that contained care standards he later tried to undercut with a new triage protocol. Yes. And either he didn't read what he signed or he read it and didn't care. That's what we're currently trying to determine, Wolk said, because one of those is negligence and the other is something else. She left for the conference room at 3:55. Maya stood in the hallway and thought about the difference between negligence and something else, and what a person did with that distinction when the outcome for patients was the same either way. Tyler appeared at her elbow, the newer nurse, who'd been solid all day in the specific way that people without much experience sometimes were solid, because they hadn't yet developed the habits that covered the gaps. The night shift is coming in, he said. Charge nurse wants to know if you're doing a handoff. I'll do a handoff, Maya said, which meant she was staying, badge or no badge, suspended or not, because 3 soldiers were in this building and they were her patients until someone else officially took them. She did the handoff. It was thorough. She walked the incoming nurses through each case, each medication, each concern she had about the next 6 hours, with the specificity of someone who knew that the handoff was the most dangerous moment in patient care, where things got missed, where assumptions got made, where the thing you forgot to say out loud became the problem at 2 in the morning. She was finishing with Kowalski's file when she heard the voices coming down the stairwell from the second floor. Not angry voices. Worse than that, the clipped, terse exchange of people who had been in a room together and had reached an outcome that wasn't consensus. Caldwell came through the stairwell door first. His jacket was still on, but his posture had changed. The held-up quality of it was gone, replaced by something tighter and less certain. Behind him came Sherry Flagg, who looked like she was very carefully not making eye contact with anyone. Behind Flagg came 2 people Maya didn't recognize but who had the bearing of lawyers. And behind them, Miriam Sato, who walked with a cane and moved at her own pace and was looking at her phone with the focused attention of someone sending a message they'd been composing for a while. Wolk came last with one of her aides. Caldwell's eyes found Maya across the hallway. What she expected was anger. What she saw was something else. A look she'd seen before on people who'd been in a position of power and felt that position becoming unreliable under their feet. Something between fury and fear, and the specific confusion of someone who had been absolutely certain they were right and had discovered too late that certainty was not the same as correctness. He didn't say anything to her. He walked toward his office with the lawyers. Sato detached from the group and crossed the hallway to Maya. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, small, with close-cropped gray hair and glasses on a chain. She looked at Maya for a moment with the kind of assessment that covered a lot of ground quickly. "You submitted a patient safety report 3 weeks ago," Sato said. "Yes. I wasn't informed of it. It went to the Patient Safety Committee, of which I am a member," Sato said, who was not informed. She didn't say it as an accusation toward Maya. She said it the way someone catalogs a fact that has implications they're going to follow up on. "I've reviewed your documentation, the triage protocol concern." She paused. "You were right." Maya didn't say anything. "The board has voted to suspend implementation of the new protocol pending a full legal and compliance review," Sato continued. "We've also voted to initiate an independent audit of administrative decisions made in the last 18 months. She looked at Maya over the rim of her glasses. "That audit will include decisions about staffing, disciplinary actions, and internal complaint handling." "All right," Maya said. "Your badge access will be reinstated today." Sato said it like a correction being entered into a record. "You'll receive formal documentation by morning." "Thank you." Sato looked at her for one more moment, the specific look of someone who was considering saying something additional and deciding against it for now. Then she turned and followed the direction Caldwell had gone, at a somewhat different pace and with a somewhat different purpose. Wolk appeared at Maya's side. "How'd it go?" Maya asked. 3 in favor, 1 against, 2 abstentions, which in board math means it passed," Wolk said. "The audit is real. They'll find what there is to find." "What will they find?" Wolk was quiet for a second. "More than what you reported," she said. "The triage protocol is the most recent thing. It isn't the first thing." Maya absorbed that. "There are patient records," Wolk said, "from the past year, cases that went through this emergency department where outcomes were not what they should have been. Cases that were documented in ways that obscure what actually happened." She kept her voice even. "The audit will surface those." The headache behind Maya's eyes sharpened. "How many?" "We don't have a full count yet." "Wolk." "Enough that it matters," Wolk said. "Enough that it should have been caught earlier." A pause. "Enough that someone should have been asking questions before you did." Maya looked at the floor. The hallway was hospital quiet now, the particular noise reduction that happened after a shift change when the overhead wasn't running, announcements, and the waiting room had emptied out some. Somewhere down the wing, a monitor beeped in its steady way. "I submitted the report 3 weeks ago," Maya said. "Yes." 3 weeks ago, something could have been, "Yes." Wolk didn't let her finish, and Maya understood that wasn't cruelty. It was precision. The answer was yes, and going further wasn't going to change the yes. She stood with that for a moment, then, "The soldiers," she said, because that was the thing she could affect. "Pruitt goes to cardiothoracic in the morning if his stats hold. Vasquez will be out of recovery by 8, and I want to be there when she wakes up. Kowalski is stable, but his pressure has been variable. Someone needs to watch his second set of overnight labs, and not just note them, actually watch them and call if anything shifts. I'll have the aides stay through the night." "Good." Maya looked down the hallway toward the bays. "I want to do one more check before I leave." "Maya." She turned. Wolk almost never used her first name. The sound of it was strange enough that Maya paid attention to what came after it. "The things he accused you of today," Wolk said, "were fabricated, and we both know it. But the way he fabricated them, the specific records he pointed to, the specific timing of the complaint, that was calculated. He knew enough to make it look coherent." She paused. "Someone helped him put that together." Maya went still. "The folder he was carrying," Wolk continued. "IT flagged the database access, yes, but the documentation he handed the officers, the formatting, the timestamps, the way the authorization discrepancy was framed, that required someone who understood how the program worked, at least well enough to misrepresent it." Someone inside the program, Maya said, or someone who had access to enough information about it to construct something convincing. Maya thought about the list of people who knew she was a consultant to the military trauma program. It was short. It was supposed to be short. How many people at this hospital know? She asked. Besides you, Volk said. Officially? None. And unofficially? Volk didn't answer right away. She looked at Maya with the expression of someone who had wanted to have this conversation in a different setting but had run out of better options. We have a communication irregularity, Volk said carefully, that we've been looking at for about 10 days. An information pathway that shouldn't exist. We don't know yet whether it originates from inside the hospital or outside it. But what happened today? She stopped. What happened today accelerated our timeline. Down the hallway, a door opened. One of the lawyers who'd come out of the board session appeared at the far end of the corridor, scanning for something. He found Caldwell's office and moved toward it. Volk watched him. Something in her posture changed. Minimal, just a degree or two, but Maya had worked alongside people who paid that kind of attention to bodies in space, and she noticed it. What did Caldwell say in the board session? Maya asked. Specifically. He made a case for unauthorized military operational presence at a civilian medical facility. It was better argued than I expected. Volk's eyes were still on the lawyer. He had specific language about the program's parameters, specific enough to be concerning, because he shouldn't have known those parameters. No, Volk said. He shouldn't have. The lawyer knocked on Caldwell's office door and was let in. The hallway was quiet again. Maya looked at Volk and understood, in the way she'd learned to understand things that were told to her sideways rather than directly, that the problem was larger than one hospital administrator with a suspension order and a folder of fabricated documentation. That whatever had happened today, whatever had started with a patient safety report and a triage protocol and a nurse being escorted out of a building, had a layer underneath it that was still being mapped. You said you were sent here to protect me, Maya said. I said that to the officers, yes. Was it true? Volk looked at her steadily. The Black Hawk was scrambled when we learned the police had been called. We were already tracking the situation here. That's not what I asked. A beat. You're a material witness to a communication irregularity that connects to an active investigation, Volk said. And yes, that makes protecting you a priority. She said it plainly, without drama. But also, you were treating my soldiers, and some things are simpler than that. Maya didn't respond. She turned and walked toward Bay 3 to do her final check on Kowalski, whose overnight labs she didn't fully trust to anyone else. Behind her, she heard Volk say something quietly to the aide. She heard the aide's response, 2 words, clipped, confirmatory. And then, faint through the wall, from the direction of Caldwell's office, a voice raised. Not Caldwell's voice, someone else's, someone who hadn't been in the board session, someone whose presence in the hospital, as far as Maya knew, had no reason to be there at all. She stopped walking. She turned back. The hallway was empty. Volk was gone. The aide was gone. Through the wall, the voice had stopped. Maya stood in the corridor and felt the specific weight of a situation that had solved one problem and opened something larger. The way a door, once forced, doesn't just open, it reveals whatever was behind it. She turned back toward Bay 3. And her badge, the badge that Sato had said would be reinstated by morning, beeped against the reader by the bay door, and the light went green, and the door opened. Someone had reinstated it already. Not by morning, now. She looked at the badge in her hand, then at the green light, then back at the hallway. Whoever had cleared her access had done it in the last 10 minutes, while the board session was still processing its decision, while the documentation was still being drafted. That was faster than any administrative process she'd ever seen move. She pushed through the door and went to check on her patient, but she didn't stop thinking about who exactly had been watching closely enough to move that fast. Kowalski was asleep when she came in, which was good. Sleep was the body doing the work that intervention couldn't do faster. His color was better than it had been at 2 o'clock. His pressure on the last manual check was sitting at 118/74, which she'd take. She looked at his chart, checked the chest tube output, within range, nothing alarming, and adjusted his blanket, which had shifted and left his left arm exposed to the room's overcooled air. Small things. The things that didn't show up in outcome metrics but mattered anyway. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. The voice she'd heard through the wall, not Caldwell's, someone else's, lower register, faster cadence, the specific energy of someone delivering information rather than receiving it. She'd heard it for maybe 4 seconds before it stopped. Not long enough to identify, long enough to know it hadn't matched anyone she'd seen come through the hospital today. She wrote her final note in Kowalski's chart, initialed it, and left the bay. The night shift was settling in. The department had that particular post-crisis stillness, equipment back in position, floor cleaned, boards updated, the chaos metabolized into documentation. Tyler was at the station doing his end-of-shift notes, moving through them with the careful slowness of someone who was tired but not cutting corners. She'd remember that about him. She found Danny in the break room, jacket on, bag over her shoulder, a look on her face that said she'd been waiting. "You should go home," Maya said. "I should," Danny agreed and didn't move. "What happened with the board?" Maya gave her the short version. Audit, protocol suspended, badge reinstated. Danny listened without interrupting, which wasn't her natural mode, which told Maya she was more rattled than she was showing. "The voice I heard through the wall," Maya said, "from Caldwell's office. You didn't see anyone go in there after the board session?" Danny thought about it. "One of the lawyers." "Anyone else?" A pause. Danny's eyes went slightly unfocused, the way they did when she was pulling something back from memory. "There was someone in the lobby when I came downstairs. I didn't recognize him. Business clothes, not hospital staff, no visitor badge. I assumed he was with the legal team." "What did he look like?" "40s. Brown hair going gray at the sides. He was on his phone." She paused. "He left when the board session ended. I watched him go through the main doors." Maya nodded, didn't say what she was thinking. "Go home, Danny," she said instead. "Document your shift notes tonight, not tomorrow. Timestamps matter now." Danny looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who understood that the instruction was more serious than it sounded. "Okay," she said. "You?" "Soon," Maya said. She found Wolk in the physician's conference room on the second floor, which someone had cleared of its usual occupants, and which now contained Wolk, 2 of her aides, a laptop, and a portable secure communications unit that Maya recognized from a different context in a different part of her life. The unit was the kind that didn't exist in any procurement catalog available to civilian institutions. She'd last seen one in a forward operating base in a country she didn't think about on days when she had a choice. Wolk looked up when she came in. One of the aides started to say something about clearance, and Wolk silenced him with a look. "You reinstated my badge," Maya said. "Joint Medical Command has provisional authority over credentialing for enrolled program consultants at participating facilities. The board's vote confirmed the administrative basis, which allowed us to move immediately." Wolk gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Maya." The voice in Caldwell's office after the board session. Someone was there who wasn't visible during the session. Brown hair, 40s, no hospital ID. He left through the main entrance when the session ended. Wolk was very still for a second. "Donnie told you?" "Donnie saw him in the lobby. I heard him through the wall." Maya sat. "Who is he?" Wolk looked at one of the aides, the younger one, who'd been quiet the whole time, and something passed between them that wasn't a word. "His name is probably not what he told the front desk," Wolk said. "We've had a partial ID for 9 days. He's connected to a consulting firm based in Harwick, a city 3 hours from here, that has contracts with 4 hospital networks in this region." "What kind of contracts?" "Operational efficiency consulting. That's what it says on paper." Wolk's tone made clear what she thought of what it said on paper. "What it actually involves is advising hospital administrators on revenue optimization, which patient populations to prioritize, how to structure intake protocols, how to document outcomes in ways that affect insurance reimbursement." Maya felt the pieces arrange themselves. "The triage protocol." "The triage protocol was not Caldwell's original idea," Wolk said. "The consulting firm proposed it. Caldwell approved it and put his name on it, which is how he's operated for most of his career. He takes external proposals from people who know how to avoid accountability and presents them as administrative decisions." "So the protocol came from outside the hospital." "The protocol, and the documentation he handed to the police today. The formatting, the timestamps, the specific framing of your database access, that was produced by someone who knew what to construct, not by Caldwell. Wolk leaned forward slightly. Caldwell gave them enough information about the program's existence to build something that looked credible. He may not have fully understood what they built with it. Or he didn't ask, Maya said. Or he didn't ask, Wolk agreed, which in legal terms is not the same thing as not knowing, depending on what the audit surfaces. Maya was quiet for a moment. The secure communications unit on the table hummed faintly, the kind of white noise that serious equipment made when it was running and waiting. Why does a regional hospital efficiency consulting firm care about a military trauma program that most people in this building don't know exists? She asked. Wolk looked at her with the expression of someone who had been hoping to have this conversation somewhere more controlled, but had accepted that this was where it was happening. Because the program is expanding, she said. 5 additional hospital networks are scheduled for enrollment in the next 18 months. The contracts for clinical infrastructure, equipment, software, training are worth a significant amount of money. And some of the firms positioned to compete for those contracts have reasons to want the program's current participating facilities to look unreliable. The room went quiet except for the communications unit. Someone is trying to discredit the program, Maya said, by creating a record of problems at a participating hospital. By creating a record of a participating hospital's consultant being investigated for unauthorized access to classified military records, Wolk said, which would have been a very effective disruption if the police report had gone forward before we arrived. Maya sat with that. The headache behind her eyes had moved into her temples. How long have you known the firm was involved with Redstone Valley? 10 days, since the communication irregularity surfaced. 10 days, Maya said, and she didn't try to hide the edge in it. Wolk didn't flinch from it. The investigation needed to be conducted in a way that didn't alert the firm to our awareness of them. Moving earlier would have. I understand the operational logic, Maya said. I'm not arguing with it. She wasn't. She just wanted Wolk to know that she understood what the logic had cost in the meantime. What happens now? Now, Wolk said, we have something we didn't have this morning. We have Caldwell, who knows enough to be useful, and is currently sitting in his office with 2 lawyers trying to figure out how much trouble he's in. And we have the man who was in his office tonight, who came here, which means he didn't know we were going to be here, which means his operational security is not as careful as he thinks it is. One of the aides said something quietly, and Wolk glanced at the laptop screen. Her expression didn't change significantly, but her attention shifted in the way that attention shifts when a result arrives. His name is Garrett Foss, she said. He checked into a hotel 4 blocks from this hospital 2 days ago under a corporate travel account registered to a subsidiary of the Harwick firm. She looked at Maya. He's still at the hotel. Maya drove herself home at 9:47. Wolk had offered an aide. She'd declined because she needed 20 minutes alone in a car to process the shape of the day before she walked into her apartment, and being driven somewhere removed that. She lived on the 4th floor of a building that was 15 minutes from the hospital, and that she'd chosen because it was 15 minutes from the hospital. The apartment had good light in the morning, and a kitchen that was slightly too small, and a bedroom where she sometimes slept and sometimes lay awake running scenarios. Tonight was going to be the second kind. She ate something, crackers, a piece of cheese, the heel of a bread loaf she should have replaced 3 days ago. She showered. She sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hand and looked at the message Wolk had sent at 9:52. Documentation package will be at your address by 0600. Review before you come in. Don't come in before 8. That was an instruction with a shape to it. Don't come in before 8 meant something was happening between now and 8 that Wolk didn't want Maya present for, or that she wanted Maya rested for what came after, or both. Maya lay down without turning the light off and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Garrett Foss in a hotel 4 blocks away. She thought about Caldwell in his office with lawyers, trying to calculate what he'd given away, and to whom, and whether there was a version of this he walked out of intact. She thought about Vasquez in the recovery room, about the 40-minute window that could have closed differently, about Kowalski's overnight labs and whether the night nurse would catch the thing she was worried about in the second set. She picked up her phone and texted Tyler, who was, as far as she knew, still doing his notes, a single line. Kowalski, overnight. Second lab set around 0200. Watch the lactate and call if it trends up. He responded in 4 minutes. Already flagged it. On it. She set the phone on the nightstand and turned off the light. She slept for 4 hours and 40 minutes, which wasn't enough and was going to have to be sufficient. She was at the hospital at 7:40, which was 20 minutes before Wolk's instruction and which she'd decided was close enough. The documentation package had arrived at 5:58, a sealed envelope with a courier service she didn't recognize, containing 41 pages of material that she'd read twice at her kitchen table with bad coffee and a growing, specific understanding of what the past 14 months had actually been. The program wasn't just trauma response integration. She'd known that much. She'd known her role was clinical, that the institutional layer was something else, that the agreement had provisions she hadn't seen. What the documentation showed her was the full architecture, a military-civilian partnership designed to improve trauma outcomes for both populations, yes, but also structured as a pilot for a national expansion that would, if successful, change how combat medicine knowledge moved into civilian emergency care at scale. It was a good program. Reading the full scope of it, she could see why. She could also see why it would be worth disrupting if you were a firm position to compete for the infrastructure contracts that came with that expansion. And she could see, reading the last 8 pages, what the communication irregularity had actually been. Someone had been leaking information about the program's structure, not classified tactical information, but operational details, enrollment timelines, facility assessments, through a channel that connected, after 2 layers of indirection, to the Harwick firm. The leak was from inside Redstone Valley Medical Center, not Caldwell. The assessment in the documentation was explicit. Caldwell's access to program specifics was limited to the agreement he'd signed, and the leaked information was more granular than that. Someone with closer proximity to the program's operational details had been the source. There were 3 people at Redstone Valley who'd had any interaction with program-adjacent information beyond the signed agreement. Caldwell was one. The other 2 were the hospital's IT director, a man named Brody Sievert, who'd configured the secure database access, and the outgoing compliance officer who'd handled the contract 14 months ago and who had left the hospital 6 months later for a position elsewhere. The outgoing compliance officer's name was listed in the documentation. It was not Sherry Flagg. Sherry Flagg was the replacement, 8 months in the role, no overlap with the program's enrollment period, which meant either Sievert had been the source for the past 8 months, or the original compliance officer had established a channel before leaving that was still active, or something else entirely that the documentation hadn't fully mapped yet. Maya had sat with those 3 possibilities for 20 minutes and then driven to the hospital. She badged in. The reader beeped green, solid, and immediate, nothing provisional about it, and went directly to the 2nd floor. Wolk was in the con's room again. She'd clearly been there for a while. There were 2 coffee cups on the table, and the laptop had the look of a screen that had been active all night. The younger aide was asleep in a chair in the corner with his jacket over his face, which was the kind of detail that made the situation feel real in a way that formal briefings didn't. "You read it," Wolk said when Maya sat down. "Sievert," Maya said. Wolk's expression gave her the answer before the words did. "Sievert was identified at 2 this morning. He's been interviewed. He's cooperating." "What did he give them?" "Operational detail about the program's timeline and facility assessments. He passed it to the Harwick firm through a private email account that he accessed from home devices, not hospital equipment, which is why it took us this long to trace." Wolk set down her coffee. "He says he didn't know what the firm intended to do with the information. He says he thought it was being used for legitimate competitive intelligence." "Do you believe him?" "His bank records are being reviewed," Wolk said, which was an answer in its way. "And Foss? At the hotel?" "Federal agents made contact at 6:15 this morning." A pause. "He's not there anymore. He checked out at 3:40 a.m. Maya looked at her. "We have a flag on his travel accounts," Wolk said. "We'll find him." She said it with the specific confidence of someone who had resources that made the statement realistic rather than wishful. "But his departure last night, it means someone told him the situation had changed." "Sievert?" "Sievert was interviewed at 2. Foss checked out at 3:40. Wolk met her eyes. "The timeline is suggestive." "So Sievert cooperated with you and warned Foss at the same time." "Or someone in communication with Sievert did. We're working through the contacts." Maya rubbed her face. Her 4 hours and 40 minutes of sleep were making themselves known in the specific way that insufficient sleep announced itself. A lag in her processing, a flatness in her peripheral vision, a tendency to read things twice before they fully registered. She knew how to function through it. She'd done it in worse conditions. That didn't make it pleasant. The audit, she said. The patient records you mentioned last night. The ones with outcome documentation problems. Wolk nodded. Is that connected to the firm? Wolk was quiet for a moment. We believe so. The documentation irregularities follow a pattern consistent with the efficiency protocols the firm recommended, ways of coding outcomes that affected reimbursement categorization. In practice, some of those codings meant that complications were attributed to patient factors rather than care factors. She paused. In a handful of cases, that coding difference meant the standard of care was not re-examined when it should have been. Maya stared at the table. Patients who had worse outcomes because care failures weren't flagged for review. That's the preliminary read. The audit will determine scope. How many cases? 17 flagged so far, reviewing back 18 months. Wolk's voice was level, the way voices were level when people had processed something and moved past the initial response into what needed to happen next. The audit team is independent. They'll be thorough. 17. Maya thought about 17 cases, about the gap between a patient who had a complication and a patient whose complication triggered a review that changed the next patient's outcome. And she thought about how much of medicine worked exactly that way, case to case, each one teaching the next one, the system learning only if the documentation was honest. He knew, she said. Caldwell knew the coding was irregular. He signed off on the efficiency protocols that produced the coding guidelines, Wolk said. Whether he understood what he was signing is what the audit will establish. He's not an idiot, Maya said. He's political and he's avoidant, and he takes credit for other people's work, but he's not an idiot. No, Wolk said, he's not. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Maya stood up and walked to the window. The hospital's main entrance was below. The curved drive, the covered drop-off, the row of trees that the city had planted when they built the new wing and which had grown in at an angle because the soil drainage on that side of the building was poor and nobody had addressed it. Normal morning traffic, 2 ambulances in the bay, neither running lights. A family coming through the main doors with a child in a stroller. Ordinary. The way hospitals looked from outside when you didn't know what was happening inside. Caldwell is still in the building, she said. He's been advised not to leave pending the audit, Wolk said. His lawyers are here. He's in his office. He's directing staff from his office. Maya turned from the window. His administrative access hasn't been suspended. Wolk's expression shifted fractionally. The board suspended the protocol implementation. The audit was initiated. His badge access, his administrative access to the patient record system, Maya said. If he knows the audit is looking at the outcome documentation and he still has access to those records, she saw Wolk catch up to it at the same moment. How fast can someone alter documentation? Wolk asked, and the question wasn't rhetorical. It was directed at Maya because Maya had worked in this system and knew its technical structure. It depends on the system and what audit trails it maintains. Ours keeps a modification log, but the log records the change, not the original. If someone replaces a document entry, the log shows a modification timestamp, but the original text is overwritten. She was already moving toward the door. Who's managing the audit's document preservation? External team. They were supposed to begin imaging the record system at 8. What time is it now? Wolk looked at her watch. 7:53. 7 minutes. Maya was out the door before Wolk finished the sentence. The stairwell was faster than the elevator, and she took it, 3 floors down to the administrative wing, moving in the way she moved in emergencies. Not running, because running in a hospital hallway drew attention and slowed you down when people stepped into your path, but fast, deliberate, the pace that covered distance without announcing itself. The administrative wing at 7:53 in the morning was mostly empty. Assistants starting their days, someone at a printer, the ambient noise of early office occupation. Maya moved through it and stopped at the door marked Hospital Director, Office of Everett Caldwell. She could hear, through the door, the specific sound of keyboard activity. Not normal typing, faster, the sound of someone working with urgency. She pushed the door open. Caldwell was at his desk, no jacket, tie loosened, both monitors active. He looked up when she came in and his expression did something complicated. Surprise, then calculation, then the specific defensive composure of someone who has been caught doing something and is deciding whether to admit the something or deny it. On the left monitor was the patient record system. The modification log was open in a sub-window. "Get out of this office," he said. "Step away from the computer," she said. "You have no authority." "Step away from the computer," she said again, and her voice did not go up, which was something she'd noticed over the years was more effective than going up. The audit team's document preservation begins in 6 minutes. Any modification to those records made after the board voted to initiate the audit is evidence tampering. Caldwell's hands were on the keyboard. He didn't move them. "Whatever you've changed in the last 8 hours," she said, "the modification timestamps are in the log. Stopping now is the only variable that affects what happens next." "You don't know what I've been doing." "I know what the modification log shows," she said. "I know what time the audit was ordered. I know that your legal team is competent enough to have told you that evidence tampering in a federal investigation carries consequences that are significantly worse than what you were already facing." His hands came off the keyboard. Not because she'd persuaded him, she thought. Because one of the lawyers appeared in the office doorway behind her. She heard the footsteps and said, in a very controlled voice, "Everett, stop." Caldwell looked at the lawyer. The lawyer was looking at the modification log visible on the monitor with the expression of a person doing rapid triage on a problem they'd just realized was worse than their morning briefing had indicated. "Everyone step back from the workstation," the lawyer said, "and someone call the audit team and tell them to start now." Maya took out her phone. She had Wolk's direct line from 2 hours ago. She dialed it, and when Wolk picked up, she said, "Tell the audit team to start the document imaging immediately. Don't wait for 8. There was a brief silence on the line, and then Wolk said, "Already moving." Maya lowered the phone and looked at Caldwell, who was sitting in his chair with his hands in his lap and the look of a man watching a series of decisions he'd made over a long period of time arrive at a point he could no longer manage. The lawyer was on his own phone. Caldwell said nothing, and then, from the direction of the main corridor, Maya heard footsteps, more than one person, moving with coordinated purpose. And she recognized the cadence before she saw who it was. 2 federal agents came through the administrative wing hallway and stopped at Caldwell's office door. One of them was holding a document that had the specific format of a federal warrant. Behind them was Miriam Sato, moving at her own deliberate pace with her cane, who had apparently been in the building since before 7, and who looked at the scene in Caldwell's office with the precise expression of someone who had suspected this for a long time and had finally run out of patience. "Mr. Caldwell," the agent with the warrant said, "we need you to step away from your workstation and come with us." Caldwell stood up. His chair rolled back and hit the credenza behind him. He looked at the agents, at Sato, at Maya. Whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't say it. He straightened his tie instead, which was the smallest and most telling gesture Maya had seen in a very long day, the habit of a man reaching for the performance of composure when the substance of it was already gone. He walked toward the door. The agents fell in on either side of him. As they passed Maya, he stopped. The agents paused with him. He looked at her, and she looked back, and there was a silence of maybe 3 seconds that contained the compressed weight of 4 years of small humiliations, of credit taken and blame assigned and safety warnings ignored, of a morning that had started with an escorted removal and was ending in something she wouldn't have chosen but couldn't pretend she hadn't worked toward. "You should have left when I told you to," he said. His voice was flat. It wasn't quite threatening and it wasn't quite conceding. It was the last exit ramp available to a man who couldn't bring himself to use the ones that had mattered. "I had patience," she said. The agents moved forward. Caldwell moved with them. Sato watched him go down the hallway and then turned to Maya with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, more the specific exhaustion of a long overdue correction. "The audit team is in the records room," Sato said. "I want to be there when they pull the imaging." "I'll walk you," Maya said. They went down the hallway together, past the open office door with its 2 active monitors still casting light into the empty room, past the assistants who had gone quiet and still in the particular way that people went quiet when something had just shifted the floor beneath them, past the windows that looked out over the hospital's front entrance where, below, a second vehicle had pulled into the curved drive with no visible markings but the specific aerials of a federal communications unit. The modification log had 7 entries from the past 4 hours. Maya didn't look at the details yet. The audit team would handle the details. But she saw, as they passed the records room and the team lead nodded at her in recognition, the timestamp on the first modification. It was from 2:43 in the morning, 4 hours after the board session, 4 hours after Caldwell had gone back to his office with his lawyers. He hadn't slept. He'd been in that chair since the session ended, and what he'd done in those hours was what people did when they were afraid and had access, and hadn't yet fully understood that the access wasn't going to save them. Sato saw it too. She didn't comment. They stood in the doorway of the records room as the audit team worked, and Maya was thinking about what 7 modifications in 4 hours actually meant. Which records, which patients, which outcomes had been considered worth the risk of changing, when her phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words. She's awake. Asking for you. She looked at it for a second, uncertain, and then understood. Vasquez. Recovery room. The aide who'd been with the soldiers, whose number she didn't have saved. She looked at Sato. I need to go. Sato nodded once, the kind of nod that contained a whole sentence. Go, she said. This part doesn't need you anymore. Maya walked back through the administrative wing and into the main corridor, moving toward the surgical recovery floor, and she was thinking about Vasquez and the leg and whether the night had been stable. And she was also thinking about Garrett Foss in a car somewhere between Delport and wherever he was going, and about Sievert in a room cooperating, and about 7 record modifications at 2:43 in the morning, and about what the audit would find in those records when the changes were reversed and the originals were reconstructed from the backup servers that Caldwell apparently hadn't known existed. She badged into the surgical recovery floor and found Bay 7 and pushed through the curtain. Vasquez was propped up at 30 degrees, alert, her left leg in an external fixation frame that would stay for weeks. She had the look of someone who'd been awake for about 40 minutes and was still assembling her circumstances. The aide, a young specialist named Reyes, who'd barely left the floor since the soldiers arrived, was in the chair beside her. Hey, Maya said. Vasquez looked at her. Her eyes were clear. Anesthesia had worn enough that she was tracking. You're the one who was in the OR, she said. Her voice was rougher than it had probably been yesterday. Yes. Reyes said you talked Ose through something. She's a good surgeon. She talked herself through it. Vasquez looked at her for a moment with the specific assessment of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. Kowalski? Stable. Chest tubes draining well. He'll be irritable by lunchtime, which is a good sign. A corner of Vasquez's mouth moved. That's his baseline. She shifted slightly and winced, not dramatically, just the small acknowledgement of pain that people made when they were trying not to make a bigger deal of it than it was. My leg. External fixator for 6 to 8 weeks. Then we reassess. Dr. Ose will talk you through the full picture when she comes in. Will I? Vasquez stopped. Started again. Function? We saved the leg, Maya said. The rest is work, and it's going to be a lot of work. But yes. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Outside the bay, the recovery floor had its steady background rhythm. Somewhere down the row, a monitor beeped twice and settled. What's happening downstairs? Vasquez said. Reyes won't tell me anything, but I can hear it from him. Reyes looked at Maya. She looked back at him. He'd clearly been fielding this question and was relieved to pass it. There are federal agents in the building, Maya said. The hospital director is being interviewed. There's an audit of patient records underway. Vasquez absorbed this with the economy of someone who'd processed worse information in worse conditions. Because of the program. Partly. And because of you. Because several things happened at once, Maya said. That's usually how these things go. Vasquez looked at her with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite appraisal. It was the specific look of one person recognizing in another person a manner of operating that they understood from their own experience. The quiet, functional competence that didn't advertise itself and didn't require acknowledgement and got things done anyway. Sergeant Whitmore, she said. Maya hadn't heard that form of address in 3 years. The sound of it did something to her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Just Maya, she said. Vasquez nodded slowly, the small nod of someone accepting a correction without fully letting go of the understanding behind it. Just Maya, she said. Okay. Maya stayed for another 20 minutes, monitoring Vasquez's vitals. answering questions that Reyes couldn't, making sure the pain management protocol was dialed correctly, and that the surgical team's morning rounds order had made it to the floor. She was adjusting the IV line position when her radio, the hospital radio clipped to her badge, standard issue, the one she'd forgotten she was wearing, crackled. It was the emergency department channel, and what she heard made her go still. All available trauma personnel to Bay 2. Incoming patient, federal agent, GSW to the chest, ETA 4 minutes. Repeat, gunshot wound, federal agent, 4 minutes out, GSW. Gunshot, federal agent, 4 minutes. She looked at Reyes. He was already on his feet. Vasquez was trying to see past her to the curtain. Stay, Maya said to Vasquez, and she was already moving through the curtain before the word finished landing. She took the stairwell at a run. The stairwell door hit the wall when she pushed through it, and she was already moving before the sound finished echoing. 2 flights down. Her hand caught the railing on the landing turn, and she took the second flight faster than was probably smart on a stairwell with fluorescent lighting that flickered at the bottom step. The emergency department was already shifting by the time she came through the door. Not the same shift as yesterday. This was smaller, tighter, the specific reorganization of a team that had already been through something and was now being asked to do it again on less sleep and higher alert. The day shift had officially started, but half of them had overlap fatigue written in their posture. Tyler was still there. He'd never actually left, she realized, or had left and come back. And he was pulling a supply cart toward Bay 2 with the focused movement of someone who'd heard the radio call and was ahead of it. What do we have? Maya said, catching up to him. Dispatch says single GSW, entry wound left chest, patient conscious on scene but deteriorating, agent on a federal detail. They're not saying whose. He handed her a pair of gloves without breaking stride. Tamblin's pulling in from the parking lot. He just called ahead. Who's senior in the bay right now? Nadia Osei came down when the call went out. She's scrubbing. Good. Osei had already proven herself last night, and she knew how to take direction without making it about the direction. The ambulance bay doors opened at the same moment Maya pushed into Bay 2, which gave her approximately 90 seconds of preparation time, which was what it was. She snapped the gloves on and looked at what they had. 2 large-bore IVs on standby, which Tyler had correctly anticipated. The crash cart was positioned correctly. Osei was at the supply counter, gloves on, assessing the tray layout with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon who thought spatially. Entry left chest, Maya said. If it's cardiac tamponade, we need echo immediately. Is the portable unit charged? Charged and ready, said a nurse she didn't know by name, but recognized from yesterday's chaos. If it's a hemothorax, we're doing chest tube right here before he goes up. Make sure we have the kit. She scanned the bay. Who's on anesthesia call? Dr. Ferris. He's been paged. Page him again. The gurney came through the ambulance bay doors with the particular momentum of paramedics who had stopped waiting for things to clear out of their way. Maya moved to the head of it. The patient was a man, late 30s, athletic build under a vest that had been cut away at the seam. His shirt was soaked through on the left side. Dark, the kind of dark that meant significant volume loss. He was conscious, which was the first thing she checked, and he was looking at the ceiling with the specific fixed concentration of someone who understood their situation and was spending every available cognitive resource on not losing the threat of it. His eyes moved to her face. Chest, he said, which was either a symptom report or a confirmation or both. I know, she said. I've got you. What's your name? Landers. A breath that was slightly off. Not the absence of air movement, but a quality to it that told her the left lung was compromised. Federal? Detail for... He stopped. Tried again. For Caldwell. The word landed in the room differently than any other word had in the past 30 seconds. Maya kept her hands moving and her face where she wanted it. Were you in the building this morning? Outside, perimeter. Another careful breath. They made contact at 7:40. Shooter was... His jaw tightened. Fast. Don't talk anymore. I need you to breathe normally and let me work. She assessed. Left side. Decreased breath sounds when she listened, which combined with the entry wound location and the mechanism told her what she was dealing with before the portable echo confirmed it 60 seconds later. Hemothorax. Blood in the pleural space compressing the lung. Not tamponade, the echo showed the pericardium was clear, but the left lung was 30% collapsed, and the rate of accumulation suggested an intercostal vessel involvement, possibly more. Chest tube, she said. Now, Dr. Osei, you want left side or do you want me? You, Osei said. I'll manage the airway. They worked. It wasn't elegant. It was the organized urgency of a team who hadn't had enough time to prepare and made up for it with precision, each person doing their piece and not requiring management of the piece next to them. The tube went in, blood drained, the lung began to re-expand, measurable on the repeat echo 3 minutes later. Tamblyn arrived at the 6-minute mark, took the situation in 5 seconds, and stepped into the coordination role without being asked, which was the best version of Tamblyn, the one who showed up when it mattered and didn't make it complicated. He's going to need thoracic surgical, Maya told him. The vessel involvement isn't resolving with drainage alone. I'm on it. He was already on the phone. Landers, through all of this, had not lost consciousness. He was watching the ceiling and breathing the way people breathed when they were concentrating on breathing, deliberate, measured, trusting the people working on him, because the alternative was to panic, and panic used oxygen. He reminded her, in the specific way that she tried not to think about during active care, of the men and women she'd worked on in places where the ceiling above them wasn't fluorescent hospital lights. She leaned into his line of sight. Vessel involvement on the left. You're going to surgery. Dr. Tamblyn is arranging it now. Landers looked at her. Caldwell's in custody? Yes. Good. A beat. The shooter, not local. Professional. She let that settle and didn't respond to it. Boss? She said quietly. Something moved in his eyes. Not confirmation exactly, more the recognition that she had enough context for the word to mean something. Connected, he said. Don't know. The breath went ragged for a second and then steadied. Don't know if directly. Don't talk, she said again. They moved him to thoracic surgery at 8:22 SA. Wolk was in the hallway outside the surgical suite when Maya came through the doors, still in her trauma bay gloves, which she pulled off and dropped in the nearest waste receptacle out of habit. Landers, Maya said. I know. Wolk's face had the specific quality of someone who'd received the same information and was processing it one layer deeper than the facts. He was one of ours. The detail on Caldwell during the federal interview, we placed him there to ensure Caldwell didn't leave the building before the warrant was processed. Someone knew that. Someone knew that, Wolk agreed. And someone positioned a shooter outside this hospital at 7:40 this morning, which is... She stopped. Which is a significant escalation from leaking program documentation. Maya looked at her. Foss. We don't have confirmation. What we have is a shooter who used a suppressed weapon from a vehicle on the street side of the hospital's perimeter, who was gone before the first patrol unit arrived, and a vehicle registration that traces to a rental account that traces to a subsidiary that doesn't exist at its registered address. The same structure as Foss's hotel account. Similar structure, Wolk said carefully. Similar is not the same as confirmed. Maya pulled off her second glove. How is this possible? You said you had a flag on his travel accounts. We did. He didn't use them. Wolk's voice was level, but underneath the level, there was something that Maya recognized as the specific anger of a professional who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding what to do about it. He has resources we underestimated, cache infrastructure, alternate identities. This wasn't improvised when he left the hotel. This was prepared in advance. He knew you'd flag his travel. He knew we'd eventually flag his travel. He planned for it. She paused. Which means whatever he's trying to protect, the firm, the contract opportunities, whatever the program's disruption was worth to him financially, it's worth significantly more than we estimated. They stood in the surgical suite hallway, which smelled like all surgical suite hallways everywhere, the combination of antiseptic and circulated air that Maya had stopped consciously noticing years ago, and now only registered when she was standing still long enough to be present in it. Landers said the shooter was professional, Maya said. Yes. Which means Foss either has direct connections to that level of resource, or someone with those connections is managing him. Wolk looked at her steadily. Yes. Which means the Harwick firm might not be the top of the structure. Which is why, Wolk said, This morning's events have moved this from a regional investigation to something with a larger footprint. She said it plainly, without drama. The agency is involved now, not just Joint Medical Command. Maya absorbed this. What do you need from me? Right now, stay in this building. Don't go anywhere alone. And Wolk paused. The modification log. The 7 entries Caldwell made. The audit team reversed them 2 hours ago. They have the original documentation. What did the originals show? 17 cases with altered outcome coding, as we estimated. But the originals also show something the modified versions were specifically designed to obscure. She held Maya's eyes. 4 of the 17 cases involved military dependents, spouses and children of active duty personnel who used this hospital through the program's civilian care provision, military dependents. The program's civilian care provision, she'd read about it in the documentation. Part of the integration's purpose was extending access to military families in the program's participating hospital catchment areas. He coded their outcomes incorrectly, Maya said. He coded complications as patient factor attributable in 4 cases involving military dependents. One of those cases, a child, age 7, experienced a significant neurological event following a procedure where the preoperative assessment was inadequate. The inadequacy was coded as a pre-existing condition. Wolk's voice did not change in quality, but something in it became more deliberate. The child has been in rehabilitative care for 9 months. Maya stood with that. Does the family know? She said. They're being contacted today. She didn't say anything else for a moment. She thought about the child, which was not a productive thing to do and was completely unavoidable. She thought about 9 months of rehabilitation and a family that had been told it was a pre-existing condition. This is why the audit matters, she said. Not to Wolk, to herself really, or to the shape of the past 24 hours, the need to say it out loud. Yes, Wolk said. The audit team's preliminary findings were presented to Miriam Sato and the board at 10 o'clock in the same conference room that had held the previous day's session. Maya was asked to attend as a clinical consultant, which meant she sat at the side of the room rather than the table, which suited her. The audit team lead was a woman named Dr. Priya Selvan, compact and specific in the way she communicated, who went through the findings with the organized directness of someone who had learned that reluctance about difficult information helped no one. 17 cases. Outcome coding altered in ways that obscured care-related complications. 4 involving military dependents. The triage protocol, had it been implemented, would have added an estimated 40 to 60 additional cases in its first year under the efficiency guidelines the Harwick firm had proposed. The Harwick firm's consulting contract with Redstone Valley Medical Center had been signed 20 months ago, 2 months before the program enrollment agreement, and contained performance metrics tied to documentation-based outcome scores, meaning Caldwell had a financial incentive, structured by the firm's contract, to code outcomes in ways that improved the hospital's reported performance data. Selvin laid it out in 40 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet. One of the board members, the one Maya had privately categorized as a Caldwell loyalist, a man named Petrovich, who had the slightly diminished look of someone whose alliances were being reviewed, said, "Is there evidence that Mr. Caldwell was aware of the clinical impact of the coding changes?" Selvin looked at him. The modification timestamps from this morning indicate that Mr. Caldwell reviewed and altered specific case files in the hours after the board voted to initiate the audit. Those specific cases are the ones with the most significant clinical impact discrepancies. The selection pattern is consistent with prior knowledge of which cases were most problematic. Petrovich said nothing else. Sato looked at the table for a moment. She was the oldest person in the room, and she had the posture of someone who had sat in a lot of rooms like this one over a long career and was not going to pretend any of it was surprising when the honest description was that it was painful. "What's the status of the federal charges?" she said. "Evidence tampering, wire fraud related to the insurance coding irregularities, and breach of the federal program participation agreement," Selvin said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is handling the charging document. We expect formal charges by end of week." Sato nodded. She looked at Maya. "Dr. Selvan's team will need clinical consultation on the 17 cases to establish standard of care benchmarks for the legal record." "I can do that," Maya said. "Starting today?" "Starting now, Sir." The clinical consultation took 5 hours and produced 38 pages of documentation that Maya wrote with the specific care of someone who understood that these pages would eventually be read by lawyers, by judges, and by the families of people who had been told incorrect things about what had happened to them. She worked in the records room with 2 members of Selvon's team, a secure laptop, and a quantity of coffee that she stopped counting after the 3rd cup. She was methodical. She was thorough. She did not rush the parts that needed not to be rushed, and she did not let the weight of what she was reading slow her past the point of function. The child's case was the 11th she reviewed. Age 7. A surgical procedure that should have had a more extensive preoperative neurological assessment, given the family history that was documented in the intake notes, documented but not acted upon, and then coded, post-complication, as if the family history had been the cause rather than the failure to adequately assess and prepare for it. She wrote what she saw. She cited the standard of care literature. She noted the intake documentation, the assessment gap, and the outcome. She wrote it as clearly as she knew how to write anything, because the family deserved a record that didn't require them to fight for the interpretation. She initialed the 11th case at 2:15 in the afternoon and moved to the 12th. Wolk came in at 3:40 with a coffee she hadn't asked for and set it beside the keyboard without comment, which was the correct way to handle someone mid-task. "Landers is out of surgery," Wolk said. Maya looked up. "How is he?" "Stable. Thoracic surgeon says he'll have full function." A pause. "He's talking." Identified the vehicle the shooter used from security camera footage. The plate traces to the same address structure as Foss's other accounts. So Foss ordered it. Foss arranged it. Whether he ordered it directly or through an intermediary is what they're working on. Wolk sat in the chair beside her. The room was small enough that they were within arm's length of each other, which was closer than their usual proximity, but neither of them adjusted. The U.S. attorney has issued a material witness warrant for Foss. His photo is going to every transportation hub in the region. "He's not going through a transportation hub," Maya said. "No," Wolk agreed. "Probably not. He has cache infrastructure and alternate identities. He planned for exactly this situation." She looked at the laptop screen. "Unless he doesn't think he needs to run." Wolk was quiet for a moment. "Meaning?" "Meaning if his position is that he's insulated enough, the layers of subsidiaries, the indirect connections, then running would be the thing that confirms his involvement. If he stays and his lawyers build a case that he's the head of a legitimate consulting firm with no direct connection to a shooter, the layered structure does its job. That's a significant risk. He's been running significant risks for a while." Maya picked up the coffee Wolk had brought. "The question is whether the evidence connects him to the shooting directly enough to make that calculation wrong." "That's what they're working on." She drank the coffee. It was bad, the way hospital coffee was reliably bad, and she drank it anyway. "How are you doing?" Wolk said. Not in the way of a formal check-in, in the way of someone asking the actual question. Maya considered lying, which would have been the shorter answer. "I'm functioning," she said. "I'll figure out the rest later." "That's very you." "Is it?" "You've been doing that since I've known you," Wolk said. "Functioning first, processing later. Sometimes later never comes." "Noted," Maya said, which was what she said when she registered something was true and didn't have the bandwidth to engage with it at the current moment. Wolk almost smiled. "Case 14 is going to be hard," she said. "I read the summary." Maya looked at her. "You read the audit summaries." "I read the parts that involve the program's covered population." A pause. "Case 14 is a spouse, 26 years old, post-operative infection that progressed to sepsis. The infection was documented as resistant strain, but the culture results in the original record don't support that classification. It was a standard spectrum organism that should have responded to first-line antibiotics if it had been treated at the 48-hour reassessment mark, which was missed, and then coded as treatment-resistant to explain the outcome." Maya looked at the screen. Case 13 was still in front of her. She finished it, initialed it, and moved to 14. She read the intake. She read the surgical notes. She read the post-operative monitoring records, the culture results, the 48-hour reassessment that had not happened, and the documentation that explained why, which was inadequate staffing, which was a real problem but not the proximate cause of the outcome. and the coding that had turned a preventable progression into a documentation artifact that made it look like nothing could have been done. She wrote what she saw. She cited the standards. She did not editorialize because editorializing would undermine the document's utility, and the document's utility was the most important thing she could provide right now. She initialed Case 14 at 4:57. Her hand was not entirely steady. She noticed that and set the pen down for a moment and breathed and then picked it up again. Wolk didn't say anything. She didn't leave either. By 6 o'clock, the federal presence in the hospital had organized itself into something that looked like a managed operation rather than a response to a crisis. There were agents in the administrative wing and in the records room and at the entrance to the surgical suite where Landers was recovering. The hospital was operating. Patients were being seen. The emergency department was running. The normal work of the building was continuing. And around the edges of that normalcy, a different kind of work was also happening, methodical and layered, and moving in a direction that had become increasingly clear through the day. Maya finished the 17th case at 6:20. She saved the document, initialed the signature line, and sent it to Selvin's secure inbox. Then she sat in the records room for a moment without doing anything, which was not something she did often, and let the specific exhaustion of the day arrange itself into something she could feel. Her phone buzzed. "Danny, you need to see something. The lobby. Now." She got up. The lobby was not empty. It should have been by this hour. Visitor hours were winding down. The day shift had transferred to evening. The main entrance typically had a certain quietness after 6 that the emergency entrance didn't share. But there were people in the lobby. Not patients, not families. People with the bearing of local press, 2 camera crews, a reporter she vaguely recognized from the Delport Evening News. And beyond them, near the main doors, a small cluster of individuals that it took her a moment to resolve into sense. Families. 3 of them. A woman in her mid-30s with a child. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, moving with the slightly effortful gait of someone who had worked hard to reclaim it. And 2 adults who might have been her parents. Another family, a couple, older, with the tight-held quality of people bracing for a room. A third, a young man alone, early 20s, who had the look of someone who'd driven a long way and was trying to hold himself together at the end of it. Danny was near the information desk. She came to Maya immediately. "They called them," Danny said, low. "The families from the cases. Someone from the federal team called them today and told them there was new information and asked them to come in." She paused. "Miriam Sato asked for them to be brought here." Maya looked at the boy near the main doors. He was holding his mother's hand. He was looking at the hospital lobby ceiling the way children looked at things they weren't sure about, with a specific mixture of caution and curiosity. "Does Sato know they're here?" "She's coming down now." Maya looked at the families and then at the floor and then, because she was Maya Whitmore, and she had never once in her professional life waited for circumstances to arrange themselves without her, she walked across the lobby. The mother saw her coming. Her grip on the boy's hand shifted, not pulling him back, but the slight adjustment of a parent who'd learned to read rooms for threat and was calibrating. "I'm Maya Whitmore," Maya said. "I'm one of the nurses here. I worked on the clinical audit of your son's case." The mother looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means that the record of what happened to him, the explanation you were given, is being corrected." Maya kept her voice steady and clear, the way she kept her voice in difficult conversations, because people in pain deserved precision. The documentation was not accurate. What happened to him was not what you were told caused it. There was a failure in his care, and that failure was recorded incorrectly, and we are fixing the record. The mother was quiet. The boy was looking at Maya now, the ceiling assessment abandoned for her face. "Why are you telling me this?" the mother said. Her voice had an edge that was not anger exactly. It was the specific sharpness of someone who'd been carrying a wrong answer for a long time and was being handed the right one in a context that made them uncertain what to do with it. "Because you deserve to know before anyone else," Maya said. The woman stared at her. The boy said, without preamble, in the direct way that children said things when they'd been thinking about them for a long time. "Is it going to be okay now?" Maya looked at him. She thought about what okay meant, about what the truthful version of an answer to that question was, about the gap between what he was asking and what was actually available. "Some things are going to be better," she said, "and the people responsible for what happened are being held accountable." That part? Yes, that's going to happen. He nodded, the serious nod of a child processing an adult answer and finding enough in it to work with. Sato arrived from the elevator with two members of the federal team, moving through the lobby with her cane and the particular steadiness of someone who had done difficult things before and was not going to make this one smaller than it was. The families and the board chair and the federal representatives began to arrange themselves into the shape of a conversation that was going to be long and painful and necessary. And Maya stepped back, not out of the room, but to the edge of it, where her role shifted from participant to available. She was watching the boy and his mother when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go. She had a specific instinct about unknown numbers that had developed over years of operational work and was usually reliable, and the instinct now was, answer it. She stepped further from the cluster of people and put the phone to her ear. Whitmore, said a voice she didn't recognize. Male, controlled. The specific register of someone who was accustomed to being in a position of authority and was not, at this moment, in a position of authority and was managing that with effort. Who is this? She said. You've been looking for me, he said, indirectly. A pause. I think we should have a conversation before this goes further than either of us wants it to go. Maya's hand tightened on the phone. The voice, not the one through the wall from Caldwell's office. Older. Measured in the way that people measured themselves when they were afraid of what they might say if they stopped. Foss, she said, a silence that was long enough to be a confirmation. There are things you don't know, he said, about the program, about what it's actually been used for, about why the people I work with considered it worth disrupting. Another pause. I think if you knew those things, you'd understand that this is more complicated than what you've been told. Maya stood in the lobby of Redstone Valley Medical Center, 8 feet from a child who had spent 9 months in rehabilitative care for a complication that had been incorrectly documented, watching Miriam Sato sit down with 3 families who had been carrying wrong answers, and listen to Garrett Foss tell her that things were complicated. Where are you? She said. Somewhere your friends can't currently reach me, he said. That's not the point. The point is, you had a federal agent shot this morning, she said, outside a hospital. Whatever you want to tell me about complicated, that's where it is right now. A silence. That wasn't... He stopped, started differently. That decision was made by someone else. I need you to understand that. Someone else in the organization you work for. Someone above me, he said. And that's exactly what I need to tell you about. Because if what I know reaches the wrong people through the wrong channel, it won't just end the program investigation. His voice was tight now, the control slightly less complete. There are individuals with federal agency connections who have a direct financial stake in the program's disruption, and they know I've been identified, and they are not... He stopped again. They are not the kind of people who handle that by leaving witnesses. Maya said nothing. You have access to General Wolk, Foss said. I need to speak to her directly, not through channels, because at least 2 of the channels are compromised. A pause. What I know about who they are will end this, but I need a guarantee I can only get from her. The lobby noise was a background, the families, the soft sound of Sato's voice, a monitor somewhere distantly beeping, the ordinary texture of a building that contained a very unordinary day. Give me a number, Maya said. He gave her a number. I'm going to verify this call, she said. Don't move. I'm not in a position to move far, he said. He hung up. Maya lowered the phone and stood with what she'd just been told, arranging it against what she knew and looking for the edges where it didn't fit. Because there were always edges, always the places where a story shaped by someone who needed something from you showed the seams. Some of it fit. The compromised channels that aligned with what Wolk had said about the irregularities. The individuals above Foss with agency connections. That would explain why someone had been shot rather than just extracted from the situation. Some of it might be designed to fit. A man who'd ordered a shooting, or hadn't stopped one, calling a nurse's personal number to say someone else was responsible, had a certain shape to it. She found Wolk on the 2nd floor. She relayed the call in full, every word, the number, the tone, the pacing of the silences. Wolk listened without interrupting. When Maya finished, Wolk looked at her for a moment and then looked at the secure communications unit on the table, And then she looked back at Maya with the expression of someone who has received information that is simultaneously useful and deeply inconvenient. "He called you," Wolk said. "Yes." "Not one of my aides, not the federal agents, you." "Yes." Wolk was quiet. Something in her stillness had a different quality than her usual stillness. "He called you," she said again, slowly, "because he knows the federal communication channels have been compromised. And because he's calculated that you have direct access to me outside of those channels." She paused. "Which means he has detailed knowledge of how this operation is structured internally." "He said 2 channels were compromised," Maya said. "His word." "If he has that level of internal knowledge..." Volk stopped. The implication sat between them like a third party in the room. If Garrett Foss knew which specific channels were compromised, it wasn't because he'd built the compromises from the outside. It was because someone had told him, someone who could see inside the operation, inside Joint Medical Command's communication structure, had been feeding him information, not Sievert. Sievert had access to hospital-level information, not military operational detail, someone closer. Wolk picked up the secure communications unit and looked at it and set it down. "Don't use that," Maya said. Wolk looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just been told the thing they'd already understood but needed to hear said out loud. "No," Wolk said quietly. "Not that one." She reached into her jacket pocket and took out a personal cell phone, the kind that command officers carried off-duty, not the unit-issued secure line, and looked at the number Maya had written on the piece of paper from the records room. "You know I can't promise him anything without verification," Wolk said. "He knows that too," Maya said. "He didn't ask for a promise. He asked for a direct channel." Wolk dialed. Outside the conference room, through the hallway window, the last light of the Delport evening was doing something to the sky that might have been beautiful on a different kind of day. The hospital lights were coming on in the lower floors, the building settling into its nighttime configuration, the steady operational rhythm of a place that didn't stop. Inside, Wolk held the phone to her ear, and Maya watched her face for the moment when Foss picked up, and when it came, a slight shift, a focusing. Wolk said, in the voice she used when she was done with anything that wasn't the essential point, "This is General Wolk. Talk to me." Foss talked for 22 minutes. Wolk stood at the window and listened with the specific stillness of someone who was simultaneously processing what they were hearing and filing it into categories: actionable, verifiable, urgent, not yet urgent. And Maya sat on the edge of the table and listened to the half of the conversation she could access, which was Wolk's face. What she gathered from that face was enough. Foss wasn't small. She'd understood that already, but the shape of what he was describing, what she could infer from Wolk's controlled reactions, from the moments when Wolk's pen moved on the notepad, from the single instance when Wolk closed her eyes for 2 seconds, in the specific way of someone absorbing something they'd half suspected and didn't want confirmed, told Maya that the Harwick firm was not the origin point. It was a layer, a managed layer with deniable distance from the individuals who had structured the disruption of the program and who had, as Foss was apparently now explaining, connections to 3 federal agency procurement officers with direct influence over the contract evaluation process for the program's national expansion. Federal agency officers, who had financial stakes in the outcome, who had fed Foss's operation enough internal information to know which communication channels to compromise and when. Wolk said almost nothing during the call. She said, "Go on," twice. She said, "Name" once, sharply, and her pen moved. She said, "How do you have that documentation?" and listened for a long time. At the end, she said, "You'll come in." Not a question, not quite an order. The tone of someone offering the only viable exit from a situation that had run out of other doors. Whatever Foss said in response was brief. Wolk lowered the phone and looked at the notepad. She'd written 4 names, 2 addresses, and a series of numbers that Maya didn't try to read. "How much of that can you verify?" Maya said. "Enough to move on tonight," Wolk said. "The rest becomes verifiable when his documentation is in our hands." She looked up. "He has files. Physical files, not digital. He was careful enough to keep the most sensitive material off any network. He'll bring them in exchange for a federal cooperation agreement. He had a federal agent shot. He says he didn't order it. He says the decision came from one of the names on this list, who determined that Lander's presence outside the hospital represented a risk that couldn't be managed through Foss's operation. She paused. If that's true, it shifts the charging picture significantly. If it's not true, it doesn't matter, because the documentation he's carrying implicates people considerably more damaging to pursue than Garrett Foss. Maya looked at the 4 names on the notepad. She didn't recognize 3 of them. The 4th she recognized because it had appeared once, briefly, in the documentation package she'd read at 5:58 that morning, a name attached to a federal procurement office, cited as a point of contact for the program's contract evaluation process. Someone who was supposed to be ensuring the program's expansion was done correctly had been working to ensure it wasn't done at all. There's a child in this hospital's catchment area, Maya said, who's been in rehabilitative care for 9 months because of what those people put in motion. I know, Wolk said, and 17 other cases. I know. Make sure that's in the record, Maya said. Whatever deal Foss gets, make sure the full scope of what his operation enabled is in the record. Wolk held her eyes. It will be. Foss came in at 10:40 that night, through a side entrance of the federal building 4 miles from Redstone Valley, with a lawyer and a document case, and the specific diminished quality of a man who had spent 30 hours outrunning a situation and had arrived at the conclusion that the running had been the wrong move. Maya wasn't there for that. She was at the hospital. She was in Bay 3 with Kowalski, who was awake, irritable about his dinner, and asking specific questions about his transfer timeline that she answered as accurately as she could. His pressure had been stable all day. His chest tube output was minimal now, which meant they were probably pulling it tomorrow. He would be transferred to a military medical facility within the week for the remainder of his recovery, which he received with the resigned acceptance of a man who understood that his preferences about the matter were not the primary variable. You look terrible, he told her. I've had a long day, she said. From what Reyes tells me, you've had a long day that started yesterday. Reyes talks too much. Kowalski almost smiled. It moved his face in a way that was clearly slightly uncomfortable, and he did it anyway, which she found she liked about him. The thing with the director, he said. All of it. Reyes said federal agents took him out. There's a federal investigation, she said. It's ongoing. But you're okay. She looked at his chart, made a note, looked back at him. I'm okay. Good, he said simply, and closed his eyes, and that was that. She left him to sleep and stood in the hallway for a moment outside his bay and thought about the word okay, about how insufficient it was and how much work it was sometimes asked to do. She was okay. She was also standing in a hospital where she'd been escorted out in handcuffs 36 hours ago, on a floor where she'd spent the better part of 2 days running on poor sleep and the particular fuel of sustained necessary work, having just spent 5 hours writing clinical documentation about 17 people whose outcomes had been falsified. Okay was approximate. She'd accept it for now. The formal charges against Everett Caldwell were filed on Friday, 3 days after the Black Hawk had landed on the parking structure roof. Wire fraud, evidence tampering, breach of federal program agreement, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, which carried the most significant penalties and which the U.S. Attorney's Office had been careful and specific about building. The Delport Evening News ran the story on Thursday night, when enough had been confirmed to report without speculation, and the National Wire picked it up by Friday morning. Maya didn't watch the coverage. Danny did, and texted her a summary. They're using his hospital headshot. He looks like he's already in a different life. The Harwick firm's offices were searched on Friday afternoon. 3 additional employees were identified as material witnesses. The firm's consulting contracts with 4 regional hospital networks were suspended pending review, which affected approximately 11,000 patients in the program's covered area and required an emergency coordination effort between the hospital networks, state health authorities, and Joint Medical Command that lasted through the weekend. The 4 names from Wolk's notepad, the federal procurement officers, were placed on administrative leave within 48 hours of Foss's cooperation agreement and formally charged the following week. The charging document was 83 pages. Maya read the summary paragraph and put it down, because the summary paragraph was enough. Garrett Foss received a cooperation agreement that reduced his exposure significantly in exchange for the physical documentation and his testimony. I was not free of consequence. The agreement still carried mandatory sentencing requirements. But he was not the largest figure the prosecution was interested in, and the documentation he'd brought in physical files proved to be as substantial as he'd represented. Maya had mixed feelings about the agreement, which she held without resolving, because the alternative, a deal that excluded his testimony and left the federal officers uncharged, was worse. And she'd learned a long time ago that justice operated in the space between what was possible and what was right, and rarely landed exactly on either. Brody Sievert, the IT director who'd leaked program information, was charged separately. He had, in the end, warned Foss, had texted an alert through a personal account 17 minutes after being interviewed by federal agents at 2 in the morning, which had given Foss the window to leave the hotel. That decision cost Sievert his cooperation credit and added an obstruction charge to the information leaking charges. He'd made the calculation that Foss mattered more than his own situation, which was a human calculation and a wrong one, and he was going to spend the next several years understanding why. The family meetings happened over 3 days the following week, organized by a patient advocacy team that Miriam Sato had assembled with the specific urgency of someone who understood that the institution owed the families action, not process. Maya attended 4 of them at the request of the families themselves. They'd been told she'd written the clinical documentation, and they'd asked for her specifically, which she hadn't expected and which required her to sit in rooms and be honest in ways that formal reports couldn't fully contain. The mother of the 7-year-old boy asked her, in a conference room on the 2nd floor, what the correct assessment would have shown. Maya told her. She didn't soften it beyond what accuracy allowed. She explained what the preoperative neurological assessment should have included, what the family history and the intake notes had indicated, what a surgeon with that information in hand would have done differently, and what different would have meant for the postoperative period. She explained it in plain language, not clinical language, because clinical language in that context would have been a way of managing her own discomfort at the expense of the mother's understanding. The mother listened without interrupting. When Maya finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He's better now," she said. "He's been working hard." "I saw him in the lobby," Maya said. "He looked strong." "He is." She looked at her hands. "I need to know that what happened to him, the documentation, the cover-up, I need to know that's being taken seriously, not just legally, that people understand what it actually costs." "The clinical record has been corrected," Maya said. "Your son's case is part of a federal prosecution. The individuals who made the decisions that led to his care failure are being charged. And the audit documentation, what I wrote about his case, uses his story specifically, without his name, to establish the standard of care that should have been applied." She paused. "I can tell you that it will be read by every prosecutor, every defense attorney, and every judge involved in this case. His experience is part of the evidentiary record." The mother looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for writing it like it mattered." Maya didn't answer because there wasn't an answer to that which wouldn't have been inadequate. She nodded once, and that had to be enough. 6 weeks after the Black Hawk landed, Redstone Valley Medical Center held a mandatory all-staff assembly in the hospital's main conference center, which had folding chairs that were always slightly insufficient in number, and a sound system that fed back if you stood too close to the left speaker. Sato ran it. She was direct and specific about what had happened, what had been found, what was being changed, and what the board's responsibilities had been and had not been met. She did not perform contrition. She expressed it and then moved to what was actionable, which Maya thought was the correct sequence. The new interim director was a woman named Dr. Colette Marsh, who had run a trauma center in a different state for 9 years, and who, in her first week, introduced herself to every department by showing up in their space rather than summoning them to hers. She came to the emergency department on a Tuesday morning and shook hands with every staff member on shift. She asked Tyler, who happened to be near the nursing station, what the single biggest operational problem in the department was, and Tyler told her honestly, and she wrote it down. Maya watched this and thought, okay, maybe okay. The emergency department's staffing was reviewed. 3 positions that had been kept intentionally understaffed under Caldwell's budget management were filled. The triage protocol was formally withdrawn, and the previous protocol reinstated while a new one was developed through a process that included clinical staff from the department rather than outside consultants. The Patient Safety Committee was restructured with direct reporting authority to the board rather than through the director's office. Small things, structural things. The kind of changes that didn't make news, but determined whether the next Maya Whitmore got heard 3 weeks before a crisis or 36 hours into one. Wolk called on a Sunday afternoon in early November, which was unusual because Wolk typically communicated through aides or text, or the formal channels that the investigation had verified were clean. The expansion, Wolk said. The program. The board cleared it 3 days ago. Maya was in her apartment, the one with good morning light that she still hadn't fully furnished despite 4 years.